Okay, we've got it together now. All right, everyone. We are going to be talking about AI agents in the context of design today, and that's a really broad topic. So my goal here, as I put kind of in the agenda here, is to start kind of more with a shared understanding of what agents are, what we think they are, what they can do, how they work, just kind of at a basic level, not really going too deep, but generally answering some of those questions. And then thinking about like, how do we design for AI agents, right? Which is kind of just this open question. I know some of you in particular have spent some time in this space, and then we've had conversations about that. But really the goal here is to kind of facilitate that conversation because we are moving so fast in the AI space. I mean, people are still getting their heads around, generative AI as a whole, and how do we build those products? And now all of a sudden we're building AI agents and they're supposed to come into our workplaces. What do we do? So this is not terribly structured, but I do have some resources for you, and I will kick it off with kind of just this idea of AI agents, what they are. I will share that in the document. Is my Fig Jam in the document? It should be linked. Yes. If you look on the Fig Jam, I'll share my screen here. I have kind of this working document on there we are, on agents. I've put a start here so you can find it. One of my favorite things about working on AI agents is that no one agrees on a shared definition. I think Erin, you know this, or Erica, you know this from your research and everything you've been doing in the AI agent space. And so I'm actually going to put you on the spot and say, what in your mind constitutes an AI agent?
So what delineates an AI assistant from an AI agent is that with assistants, you specify the time, the how, and the what will happen. And with
Mhm.
agents, you specify a goal, and then the agent self-determines a particular way of getting to that goal and a plan, and may even do self-initiated tasks for you as it evolves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really that goal orientedness is definitely defining an agent. It's interesting too, because I realized I asked that question and I didn't even specify whose perspective, right? We're asking this from, because as a user, you probably don't even care. I just had this conversation with Jackie, like, does the user care if they're using an agent? Do they know if they're using an agent, right? Like, do they care about these definitions? I actually don't know. I know I did see a recent study that said a lot of customers don't care about your product being AI powered. I thought that was really interesting. But I don't actually know. Do users care if it's an AI agent or not? I don't know. It's kind of an open question. Do
We
you
did
know?
we did our we have one sample, but we did our defining success and we wanted to focus on AI agents, but what we realized is that people were just like, that's just another AI. Like, so when they talked about defining success for that, they thought about it in terms of just AI. Like, this is just another
Mhm.
AI application.
Uh-huh.
So they grouped them together.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So we have that. So there's the user perspective. We still have open questions on, but we're seeing some data that they're just kind of grouping AI. It's AI, right? Kind of this opaque term. And then we have the designer perspective, which as a designer, I need to design these systems, right? So from that perspective, I need to know kind of what are the differences and the nuances in these products, right, that we're building for, or that we might be interacting with in our own organization. And that's where it starts to help to understand. That's where it's helpful to kind of understand what's happening with these. It depends on, what definition you're taking, but overall themes about AI agents are about kind of this idea of goal, right? They're going to achieve a goal, and the agents are going to do it either autonomously or semi-autonomously, meaning you're going to give them some information and they're going to make the decisions. Okay, and I say it could be one agent, it could be multiple agents inside one big system. You probably won't know unless you're the designer building it and working on it. But generally, we have the components of large language models, so generative AI or vision models, plus data. So oftentimes we're accessing data through tools. And the agents themselves have decision-making capabilities. These are usually done with a model, a large language model, that takes in information and makes decisions about that around either how the work should be done or what tools to use and so on, and then some degree of autonomy. And I think the autonomy is probably one of the most important challenges and maybe opportunities for designers to think about is how autonomous should these systems be, and when should users participate in working with agents? So I will go just quickly. I'm not looking at the doc right now. Do I have open thoughts on this definition? Open thoughts in general about these AI agents as we kick it off. Um, I think one of the things that's useful is like making it at least look visible. So I'm going to show you just kind of very abstract examples of agent systems. What constitutes an AI system when we're building it? We often have the user input. We have an agent. The agent has the ability to call tools and then put out a result. So this is like a single agent, right? And again, the differentiator being this agent can reflect on the question. So if I say, write me a report and do some data analysis and of my, of this spreadsheet I've given you, and then create some visualizations. And by the way, put it all in this the style of my organization. It can do that, and it will make the plan, grab the right tools, and deliver the output. Puts a lot of stress on the system to have to do all that, on the model to do all that, but it can, okay? And it will execute that. You can give it the task, walk away for a little bit. It will take probably several minutes to do and then give you an output. And it will probably be better structured and more robust than if you just gave that task to the LLM itself, because the LLM, if we were looking at like ChatGPT or something like that, might not have access to the tools or the data. So that's one version of an agent. The more as we move forward in the agent space, we have multiple agents working together. And this is where it gets interesting, because if you are the user, you don't likely care about how many agents you are using, how many agents are getting your response. You're probably not even going to see it, actually. And this is something that actually Pedro, I think, had brought up. It was like the user is only going to see one agent. But you as the designer need to know, wait a minute, is this a system in which we have many agents working together to complete a task? And if so, what are our agents doing? Because as a designer, you need to know kind of the pieces of how this all fits together so you can decide how the system is supposed to act, where the user is supposed to give guidance, where they're supposed to give feedback, and so on. And so this is an idea here. Torian, do you have a question?
I didn't want to stop your train of thought, so like let me know and I'll just like have something to add once you finish like this portion.
Okay. I'll
Yeah.
just focus on this one quickly. If the user gives a task, and then they'll have we have an agent who decides what should be done. What is the work to be done? It passes that information off to a new agent. This is the research agent. It's going to go off and find a bunch of information. You can see here, kind of from this diagram, it's going to access these tools. I'm not naming them, they're just arbitrary. Once it gets that information, it's going to pass it on to the writing agent, which is going to access these tools over here. This is very linear. It doesn't often happen linearly. We're going to allow some room for some human input. So this is an agent that deals with the human inputs, sends it over to the writing agent. And we have an editing agent to clean it all up and make it in the style you want. And then now we have the output. That is an example of a multi-agent system working together using tools to improve the output. And if this is abstract, don't worry. We're going to move to Manus AI and actually see an agent from what it looks like from the UX side.
Mhm.
Yes, Toria.
Cool. So I was gonna say, so would you, I guess, if we were to insert us as designers into this flow, would
Mhm.
you almost visualize each individual agent as like meta personas that we would
Yes.
like design for like, okay, what would be the perspective of a research agent and what type of input would they require from an orchestration agent to get the best output out of their like internal prompts back and forward?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask. That's exactly the question we want to ask as designers. And so So excellent. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. So what I would think about is if I were designing this and if I were working with the engineering team to design this, I'd say, okay, what's the expected flow of this task? Let's assume the task is write me a report, okay? Detailed report using my data. I would ask, okay, what do we assume the reasoning is going to be, right? And you can look at that by looking at a model. When I talk about reasoning, we have these models like Sonnet 3.7, OpenAI's model, where you see the thinking of the model, and basically it's planning things step by step by step, right? Those are reasoning models. And so it's going to make a decision about the work to be done and then hand it off to this. It's going to first call the research agent, and then the research agent is going to decide what tools to use. Now, you as the designer, I would say, would define what's the scope of the research,
Right.
right? Knowing what the tools it has access to, because the tools could be data, right? This could be databases, this could be a search tool, right? Search the web, things like that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this question necessarily has an answer right now.
Yeah.
It's just so like, like I wonder where. I guess it really starts to get into the altitude at which you feel human intervention is being applied from like our standpoint as designers, as well as like a external user, like the human input. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, yeah, trying to gauge, I guess, the proper threshold of complexity, even when it comes to Erica's definition of where do we draw the line between this is best use cases for agents versus just assistive AI, and how do we make sure that line doesn't get blurred? Is it a matter of scale and complexity or the requirement of human intervention to ease the efficiency of said task? Like, yeah, there's a lot of different like complexity scales that I'm trying to traverse as we talk about singular agents, multi-agents, and how they work underneath the hood as well as, externally
Yes.
once it's deployed into an environment.
No, that's exactly it. You have these layers of complexity. And Austin, I know you have your hand up, so I'll change it to you, but these layers of complexity here. And so that's when, if we look high level about how you staff these projects, having one designer on a project like this doesn't work. You have so many elements. It's not, as we see, it's not just the UI, but it's working in tangent with the developers to really understand, okay, what type of system are we building out here? And what's the expectation of this system, right? And from there, then we can start to say, okay, what's the goal? What problem are we solving? What's the goal this agent's supposed to solve? And how is this agent going to solve it? Because that's when we start looking at, okay, if the agent's going to do it, in XYZ way, then where do we design these touch points in the system for the user to interact with the agent? Or is
Right.
this agent going to just do it autonomously and the human doesn't do anything but give an output? That's a decision too, but you can't have that kind of conversation unless you're getting under the hood and saying, okay, how does this work? What's the goal?
Right.
Yeah. Austin.
So the piece that I thought was missing from the diagram was like, what's the relationship to the underlying model? Is it reasonable to say that like the agent or the assistant, depending on what you're substituting in there, is defined by the underlying model?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's two pieces that you have. You have the agent, you have the architecture. So how am I building this system? Although I'm not going to go super in depth, you can look at this on your own time. These agents can also do things in parallel, and the agents can talk to each other and make decisions that the user will not see, right? So that's far more complex. And so you have the architecture that also influences it and the model itself, right? Going back to if this is the orchestration and planning model, that's going to have a very different task than the research one.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it in relationship to how we're building things in GitLab. It's like what I'm curious about, because we're talking a lot about like what's on the back end of the system, what's happening beneath the surface that we should be aware of as designers. And then I'm thinking about, well, what surface is up to the user for that like input task or the output, the way that it comes out. Like we kind of are focused very much so on those two things from like Duo chat or workflow, maybe even the way you interact a little bit with the agent. Thinking like, well, what are the UI elements that like cues into a user that this is more than just talking see something that can figure out a how, what, when situation, but it can do more tasks. Because as he was like demoing and with Manus, I was watching the video. I'm like, this doesn't look any different than like the UI for the most part you saw with ChatGPT when it first came out. Like maybe some
Yeah.
small nuances have changed. Like, it's a little icon that looks more like an agent as opposed to more of like a search or reasoning box. But like to just the user, you just gave them the open text field and said, have at it, So it's interesting to think about, like, as the underlying things change and evolve, how might users want to expect to react to it? Which then kind of leaves us in an interesting position, because we're, at least as far as I'm aware, we're not in the business of building models. We bring them to customers to use, and we give them a UI to interact with them. So
Right.
then what do we do as we have to kind of like surrender control and say, like, yeah, customer can choose to use Claude here, or they might choose to use a different model here. Like, we don't necessarily have the like control over the user experience that comes out of those things. We just have to then handle them
Yeah.
gracefully.
I would say, yeah, and to some degree, you're right. We have to, I think as designers, if you think of before ChatGPT, right? So like before we had to go into this whole generative AI thing, we were very much in this like, if I build this, this happens. This like, and then sometimes your users would do things that we didn't expect, but that was fine. But we knew what the system would do, right? What the users did was another problem. Now we don't necessarily know what the system's going to do. I don't know what the output is going to be. I can guess from experience, but I don't always know. And when we start to look at these systems, right? And so we have these compounding effects. I've got one agent giving information to this agent, which draws tools from here, which gives to this agent. And now I've got human input. And now this editing agent is going to go fix it all up, right? I couldn't tell you what that output's going to look like. As a user, I couldn't. As a designer, I can say, this is what I want my output to look like. And that's really design's role here, is to say, you're building an agent that creates reports, vague reports. This is what I want it to look like. This is your target, right? And so that output is really defined based on what you know from best practices and your style and all that kind of stuff, and what you know the user needs, but also built on what the capabilities are of the agent, right? If your agent can't do data analysis, then don't put data analysis in the final report, right? So there is still this kind of like, you can go for an ideal, and it helps engineering to build that ideal, right? But to some degree, yeah, you're responsible for like, how do you help the user shape this? Because the user is collaborating with these tools.
Yeah.
To a degree.
And but yeah, what I've experienced as a user of trying these different tools out there is I have to go figure out, what is that tool even good at? What's its purpose?
Yeah.
Because if I ask it to do something it's not designed for, then like it's not very good at it. And then you're like, oh, like the reports aren't very good from this. Well, you asked the wrong tool for that. Like if I just ask it to write me code snippets and it's designed for report generation, like it's not going to do a very good job. Likewise,
Yeah.
like the model that's very good at handling view, not very good at writing HAML. So, like great for diagnosing problems with view, awful at diagnosing problems with HAML. If I choose the right tool for the right problem, nice. But then like nothing is really telling me in the UI, like, oh, hey, this is designed for this problem. So then you got to kind of like just figure it out, which is yeah, it's like overwhelming to figure out as a
Yeah.
user. It's just like trial and
I would
error, like,
agree.
oh, it's not good for this, all right, move on with another one.
All right. So then as the
Yeah.
designer, the question becomes, how do you reduce that cognitive load? How do you
Yeah.
increase transparency about capabilities? Those are fundamental design things that we do really well. It's just applying it to kind of this fuzzy space, because that then you have to define that, which means you then need to go find out, what does this agent do well and what does it not do well? You're really defining the scope and the boundaries of these systems. And that's why looking under the UI and saying, how does this actually work, is really necessary when it comes to these agents, because that's how you then communicate to the users, you can't do that, or here's what you can do. Is this a narrowly scoped agent, or is this a general agent that can do everything, right?
Totally.
I included this in here just as an example of the human in the loop input here, and then I'm going to move on to the demo. This is called the happy path. This is what we hope will happen. It doesn't always happen. But the idea here that the user communicates the task, the agent confirms it, shows the tasks, agent communicates, agent asks for approval, user approves. So this is like a semi-autonomous, right? So it's taking on these tasks, it's moving towards a goal. I should say communicates goal, but task, we go back and forth on the language here. And you can start to see where in this hypothetical case, the user we've built in pauses and moments for the user to give feedback, right? And added that human in the loop within an autonomous, semi-autonomous system. And that's kind of what it looks like. That's a lot of what it looks like when you start to look at these systems and figure out, what are we building? What's the goal? What is the agent going to do? Great. When does the user need to participate? And the answer is always going to be, it depends on your agent, right? And on that note, Manus AI. Manus AI, I'm going to pause real quick and look at the document because I haven't looked at any questions on there. So far, no questions. Okay. Great. So how many, like, has anyone seen the Manus demo somewhat? Okay, okay. I will show one of the ones on there was really super interesting. So Manus is designed as a general purpose agent. So the idea here is it's not narrow in scope. It can do many, many different things. For example, when we look at Manus's website right here, it's a general agent that bridges minds and action. It doesn't think, it drives results. Now, we're looking at marketing copy. This is marketing. This is what they do well, right? Sell us on the vision, sell us on the idea. And I will add the disclaimer, we are watching demos and we all know that demos are not reality. And so, but what I like about demos, what I really like is that it helps facilitate a conversation about something that can be really abstract, like what we just talked about, right? Like what's happening. And so if you look at the use cases here, you see just kind of a variety of options. When we talk about general use case, it could do everything from, research to data analysis to teaching and education, WTF, I don't even know what that is, screenplay development, right? So we have all these use cases, which by the way is great for your user, right? Who's trying to figure out, what does this tool do? I still couldn't tell you what the scope of this tool is. I don't know. Can it do everything? I have no idea. Side note, I'm not going to find out because hardly anyone's had access to this. I think 1% of user requests have had access to Manus so far. But we'll look at this use case, which is they're going to research DeepSeek's 5 most recent open source projects on GitHub. Okay, we're just going to watch the process. This is real time meaning what was recorded, but we can assume this is real time. We've got a lot to look at. And we can see it's thinking, updating. We've got to the right over here, Manus is working. It's telling you what it's doing. We're seeing the computer terminal. It's using an editor. It's using terminal. It's using editor. We have buttons that are disappearing. I can't even click it. We have a lot happening over here. Do we have any copy people in here? There's just a lot of information. Okay, and so it's updating along the way. I'm going to scroll back. We have the option to kind of, it'll tell you, first off, it tells us what it's going to do. It's going to gather information, how it's going to start. I have the option to click in and reduce this. It tells me the 5 projects it's identified. Now it tells me its next step. I'm going to close these. It's telling me they're browsing, all this kind of stuff. It's telling me it had success. Now it's going to go through each one systematically. Great. So it's updating me. I would argue a lot of unnecessary information here, but okay. So now we have the result. That took, I don't remember how long it took, a minute or 2. And this is my report based on GitHub, searching GitHub. Which is cool, right? Is it, we have multiple tools. We have the ability to download. We have some repetitive information here, delivered comprehensive report, deliver research finding to users. So this is still a product in development, high level thoughts just on what you just saw. Questions, open questions.
The future is now.
I
One
was
of the
thinking as it was like constructing and thinking alt stuff. It's like, man,
Mhm.
we got to define all those elements. If we, if Duo was to do the same thing, then like, how
Mhm.
ready is our design system to be used in such a manner? Like, can we build all those code blocks? Can we have all those elements? Like, are there enough Lego pieces to support the needs of whatever we want these assistants to do or agents to
Yeah.
do? Because if we don't have a UI element for it, then it'll just use like whatever the browser default is, and maybe not look like we intend it to. We
Yeah.
can't tell it not to, I guess. I guess it maybe depends on how it's constructed, but yeah, it's just gonna probably just start rendering things, and I don't know what it will use if it doesn't have the right component available.
Yeah. So part of that going back to like, okay, what are we building? What is the expected output? So we know, right? And being able to prototype early on and test out these things too, right? To be able to say, okay, what are we rendering? What's the scope of this? And that's something that design can help with, is that scope. And they bring in that component of like, oh, do we even have this capability in the UI?
and
Because
Yeah.
the engineers are focused on connecting. Yeah, go ahead, Erica.
I think that this is all like V1 and that it's pretty chat based and that we're not doing anything with agents yet, that we are not doing in chat, and the two experiences are pretty parallel. But if we can if we know that and then can start thinking about what orchestrated agents like might afford and what it might look like. One of the pieces of feedback, I linked to the report that Roger and Penny and I were working on, and kind of started that was your exchange with Michael Friedrich, which is slide 38. I posted it as like the muse that started me down this journey. But it kind of the way that Michael's feedback presented to me is that he was kind of saying that in this interface, which is very much similar to Duo Workflow, FYI, that it felt like he was a quarterback, like sending off this Hail Mary pass, and then he would just like see what happened with the play and not have any way of like stepping in. And that the way he was kind of talking about it is he needed to be able to play midfield. So he needed to be able to like check in and see the information and be able to like stop things and resituate the play.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for linking to the report that you made from that, because it was really helpful because it gave different mental maps for thinking about these agents and how we might work with them. I think from one of the things that kind of came out of both of yours is like the thing that it's going to say. What is it going to say, right? How do we know what it's going to say? And I think that that's again part of like our role as design, is to be able to say, okay, this is what we want to show to the user, and this is where we want the user to interact. You'll notice in this one, granted, this is a demo, but I'm not even seeing anything. This is an autonomous one. It just did everything.
I think with this one, I'm very curious what was the rationale for the design decision to show so much and to show it happening so fast to the user? Like, who in their audience is benefiting? Because a human can't process and follow everything that's happening there so quickly on two separate sides of the screen. It's just overwhelming. Why do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that was also my takeaway, that was my first takeaway was this is very overwhelming. Wait a minute, how do I find information? Because we know from research, I mean, I've watched so many YouTube videos from people working with various agents and assistants, and we know that these agents make mistakes, the assistants make mistakes, and people have to go back and troubleshoot. So they do want to see information that guides them in this troubleshooting process. So that is good, but it's a balance, right? Because I closed this so I didn't have to look at all of these pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think Austin has the reason. I mean, I think he mentioned it in the chat, is like, it seems like they're just trying to impress marketing, right? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, everything's happening.
Yeah. Like,
It's
oh, look at all
doing
the
it.
stuff that it's doing. It's really cool and technical and smart.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely like that. And I think too, like there's this kind of piece where, I mean, look, the founders of this, like they put this out early, right? They were like, look, this is not the final product, but we're putting it out so people can test it. And they don't even have the support, the infrastructure right now to handle the demand. So it's crashing a lot. So like these guys are really early on in their kind of product development. And we know kind of from experience and also in the AI space now, we tend to put products out before they're ready in the AI space to really test them and get users to give feedback and see what's actually happening because there's so much a user can do in this space. So they're really learning. And I think users have given us some permissions to do that. And at the same time, it's kind of like, well, what am I supposed to do with this if we could use it, right? Torian, your hand was up.
Yeah, no worries. So I guess I'm almost thinking like to Erica's point, this is very similar to what we already know within ChatGPT, especially when it's like, hey, I'm just doing some reasoning on the back end without going through every detail of the reasoning. And so I guess my question would be from a user's perspective, and Austin, feel free to like kind of hop in as far as expectations. Would you feel like an agent would be more suited to like, let's say if I said build an application, so that way like there's implicitly a lot more steps that goes into it, and instead of showing me the what you're looking up as far as the reasoning pieces, it's almost being like taking a breath and saying, in order to make this application, I think I should do this. And then you either approve or deny that step. And then it kind of goes to the next step of this process and saying, okay, well, I had established the backend framework. What do you think I should do next? And like kind of like have more of a midfield style of experience of building something a lot more robust outside of just like a report or just something that's text based. Because I feel like that's where it feels like it's not doing enough because it's like build me an app that I can publish in like the App Store today so I can see on my phone. It's like it's more than just something I can copy and paste into another Word doc, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That was a
Yeah,
very open, but yeah, feel free anyone to kind of just jump in.
I think your point, this is also kind of the challenge right here is like, one, where are the agents? We want to look at tons of different types of agents, but it is pretty, the UI is going to be specific to your use case. In this case, we're looking at, a report being produced, but if we were building an app or a file or making file revisions in my code base, then there's a greater risk to my project if the agent gets it wrong. So it almost then implies, let's give the user control, right? And that's again for the design team to figure out when does the user need control and where in the process should the agent seek feedback, i.e. when should we give the user control of the process? And
Yeah,
what does control look like from a UI point of view?
yeah, that's right.
I think Manus has some use cases where it's doing more than assembling a report, right? Like, does it
Yeah.
have somewhere it's like can book a trip for you or anything like that where it's actually
Yeah.
doing
Let's see.
something?
Trip to Japan.
Yeah.
All right, let's run this one.
All that one's playing. One thing I
Yeah.
was just thinking to myself is it feels like a lot of these companies are just pumping out all these experimental tools with relatively polished UIs, it feels like. And I'm just wondering, why is it so hard for us to do it? Like if these companies are putting it out early, giving people early access to it, I'm like, this is not what like an early access thing looks like at GitLab. So I'm like, what's the gap that makes it so much harder for us to put something together, something like this, in comparison? That's what I'm trying to think through.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing I would say, and I know this isn't answering your question, Austin, but a lot of the early things that companies are putting out are geared towards like specifically early adopters or people who are interested in experimenting, whereas our customers in most cases are large companies that are running a business, and so they're not necessarily looking for that experimentation, like they're looking for something that works right away. I know that doesn't answer your question, but
I mean, I think it kind of does a little bit, and maybe it leads me to my next thought, which is I think we then jump to how do we make this thing work with GitLab right now, as opposed to going, let's build something in isolation, expose it to customers so they could try it, even though it's not in the GitLab ecosystem, you know, it's not in the GitLab folder, it's not in our nicely packaged IDE extension, it's its own independent app that they could try, but we just don't have, I think, that muscle memory of trying out things that way.
Hmm.
So I think maybe we're thinking about like do a workflow. We're thinking about how do we get this to work in GitLab, the web app, how do we get it to work with the extension, as opposed to like, does this interaction even make sense? Is the output working? And then that kind of delays that understanding because we're so focused on how do we get it to just like work with our things we already have. Maybe
Yeah,
that's the hurdle.
yeah. And I think I hear what you're saying. Like if we worked a little bit outside of out of GitLab, we could be more experimental.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, you look at these startups, like they're startups, they're creating something new, right? And not creating within. I also think it comes down to prioritization, right? What is the priority? Is the priority for it to like make a big splash and look good and feel right? Or is the priority to get it, you know, just working within our systems? And that, you know, those are trade-offs when it comes to resources. And I would love to see this, you know, in our products, not this, but like this type of UI. I just think it makes, you know, we already have these hurdles with users who are trying to figure out how do these tools work? How am I supposed to use them? Where do they fit? Right? So let's make it easy for them. UI, a good UI with clear communication, clear system communication, is part of that. Torian?
I will stop talking after this, I promise.
That's
Um,
okay.
Speaking of UI, have any of you played around with Google AI Studio where you can interact with the agent while you're sharing your screen?
Ooh.
So yeah, you can share your screen and I can like, let's say for instance, I don't know how to set up my Google Calendar. So I can share my screen and have it like talk me through it. Whereas
Okay.
normally, like we talked about using text-based to say, hey, how do I do this thing? And like going back and forth with, you know, Claude or ChatGPT or whatever. Well, yeah, like Google AI is playing around with being able to share your screen and say, okay, let's use our voice and our screen share. So we're giving our agent's eyes and using our voices to like have that interaction. So yeah, there goes your UI. Let's play around with how that plays
Voice.
in the industry.
Yeah. There, that's also we're seeing that in other products too, right? Just even with LLM assistants, they're just using voice to talk to it now. They're not even typing it in, right? And voice designing for voice is still different than designing for, they're both natural language, but the inputs are different. And so that's also another layer of design. I put this in the document over here. Before I move on, by the way, this is building the trip. So one thing to note is it tells you what tools they're using. I don't know if you paid it during the session, it tells you what tool it's using browsing, and you can see here, it's actually looking at the page. So having that visual component, this is multimodal, meaning it doesn't just look at text, it can look at visual, websites and screenshots and stuff like that. It's using terminal here, it's searching. So it kind of brings you along to know what it's doing. Is that useful for the user? I actually don't know. I would love to know. Does the user need to know what the tool is that you're using? I
Well,
don't know.
when I think about agents, I think about something that's going to do this on your behalf. And this still
Mhm.
feels like more of a deep research LLM
Mm,
thing. I mean, it's definitely using different tools and websites to collect research from different places and build this itinerary, but it's not booking anything for you.
yeah.
I'm asking a lot there. I know that would be hard, but I feel like that's sort of the promise of agents that I've heard, or the narrative. And so this isn't what I would expect.
Yeah.
Would you expect it to basically say, now that I have an itinerary, let's like book it? Like, can you integrate your Expedia account with
Yeah, like I found these flights, this is how much it is, these are the hotels, and it actually has my permission. I've pre-authenticated or whatever needs to happen so that I can then say yes, go, and it would book those things.
Yeah.
There's like something operator, OpenAI is something called operator, I think, which is also this,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at it. So I clicked on this one because your point is so valid, right? Because a lot of it, if we're working on like do a workflow, we're creating files, we're completing tasks, we've sent MRs, like we're engaging and creating these things. And that's a very different use case than just deep research, to your point, right? And again, going back to how do we design for these? Well, it depends on the task. So I don't know, like when we decide when the user should have input, depends on what the agent's supposed to do for them. This demo is on interview schedule creation, and it went pretty fast. And it looks like it's going to terminal, it's creating files, it's creating sessions. It created a script. Okay, so the schedule's been validated, but it didn't actually say, it just created a schedule. So it didn't actually schedule anyone. So yeah, take action for me. Do the work. Do the hard work I don't want to do. I don't want to schedule anyone.
It's so funny
Oh,
because
what
like
a
getting this
nightmare.
part done is also like hard work, but it's like cross the finish line.
Yeah. So then the question is, but what if it makes a mistake, right? So let's say your agent, you're like, yes, book them all.
Hmm.
Well, it can do that. Let's go a step further. It's like, great, I approved the schedule. I looked at it, but I didn't realize I had a conflict. That has
Right.
messed everything up. What do you do as the user? Do you ask the agent to redo it all with that conflict, or do you manually go do it?
Or do you say the dog ate your homework and you expose that you haven't been doing your job for the past 6 months?
Do you just close your laptop? But this is also kind of the piece here, is because the thing about these systems, and this one is like we're on a demo, so this is a lot harder. But if we think about other agents in the market that are out there, especially in the software development space and our own, we know that users are iterating with these, right? It's not just give me the result. Most time we cannot rely on agents to get it right. This
Right.
is how I feel about designing for agents. In the past, we all assume things will be correct. That is no longer the case. So we really have to design knowing that things aren't going to be correct. And we have to think ahead. So when a user gets a result, what are the top 3 to 5 actions they'll take after getting a result?
Right.
And
So
that's another way that this differs, is thinking about these tools as collaborative tools, and the users are going to iterate with these tools, regardless if they like, they might send a file, create a file, schedule the interviews, whatever it is. That's one path. But what are the other paths? And that's the role of the designer as well,
yeah.
is to really define those paths and then design solutions for those paths.
So then basically, would the designer, let's say Austin isn't here anymore. Okay, I'll just say Austin, name drop. So let's say that Austin is designing this. And if we're thinking about this from the standpoint of agents as people or interns, then what would
Mhm.
be the fail safe when your intern screws up? Like
Yeah.
you would either manually create like the apology email and give a maybe like post date the correction as far as okay, we'll reschedule this for best time, whatever, or potentially doing it in line and saying, okay, well, there's been an update to your calendar if they haven't responded to it yet. So I guess it's almost like redesigning this workflow with the error in mind,
Yes.
and then either having like an agent do that. Because even today, like I make mistakes on my calendar and I double
Hmm.
book, things happen. And so when those things come up, it's almost like installing um, a center fielder agent of sorts that would be able to interpret any updates to the change or any mistakes that have been made, and then be
Hmm.
to create a process of contact so and so, reach out to back to your multi-agent system, reach out to the agent of scheduling record and organize that correction with communication or whatever the case may be. It feels like you're almost like creating an overlap of compliance for all of those like else if scenarios when things fall through the cracks. So it's like you're
Yes.
yeah, like double designing meta inception possibility.
Well, yes and no. Yes. Yes, the idea of I have to think through the process. And this is where, you know, we, as designers, we did in traditional linear software development process, we kind of do our thing and then we hand off. But this is where everything starts to change, where you need to be working closely with the developers and saying, okay, you are designing the happy path. That's what developers do. They say, this is how it's going to work. And then they plan for everything that's going to work and they send an error message if it doesn't. And that's that, because that's their job, is to make the systems work. But our job is to make the systems work for our users and anticipate when they don't work. And because AI agents break a lot or come up with unexpected outputs, our job then is to really bring light to that and say, okay, how could this go wrong? And then how do we design affordances, either in the language or in the UI, to help our users? And so it's really shifting our mindset from like, this is how it works to this is how it doesn't work and how we're going to help people out. Right? You really have to have both. You have to have the happy path and the unhappy paths. But going back to the idea of an error, right? Which, as you see on the screen here, one of the things we see in other products, and Taylor and I were having a conversation about this yesterday, was, you know, this option to undo. And it's not just undo everything, because maybe I don't want to start a whole workflow over, but what are the critical points in your workflow as you are iterating with your agent that are almost serve as checkpoints, where the agent is going to do something that's going to change, you know, your file structure, your code base, or something like that, and that you could go back to and undo in the future. So that way you don't lose all your work, but you lose some of your work. And you help give the user an idea of where they're at in their workflow. Because again, the agents are making decisions behind the scene, the agent or the agents. And the user may not have all that information about what the agents are doing. And so I saw in a recent video, someone got really confused. They're like, I don't understand what has happened. And even though the system was telling them what happened, she was like, I just don't understand though. How could it have known that? What is it trying to do? So your users are going to get confused. And so you got to give them visual cues and places in the workflow for them to go back to as a kind of an anchor.
Yeah, that sounds that reminds me a lot of like game design. Like when you get to that point in the level and like, okay, if I move forward, if I die, I don't start over, but I go back to that one little part before I get to the boss to like, you know, collect some weapons and blah blah blah.
Yeah. Taylor, do you want to? Yeah, exactly. And Taylor just wrote something similar
I
in the
literally
chat.
just wrote the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I see you, man. Good stuff, man.
Taylor, you want to expand on it?
Yeah, it's basically just, it feels like we're entering a much different era of design that's more probabilistic and having to think through problems a lot differently. Usually it's very much if this, then that. We have a very structured way we do handoff specs. We work with engineers together, but it's a very much like, feels much more like defined. And yeah, I've just been thinking that patterns from how video game designers or creative directors work, it's starting to feel like that need to co-create, to iterate faster by keeping things low fidelity, working through problems and thinking through things in more of a way of like decision trees, and really not just one easy linear user journey.
Yeah.
So just some of the things I've been thinking about of how I might need to adapt my work.
Yeah. The linear piece kind of goes out the window. It really is this kind of, it's cyclical, not cyclical, but like that, what's that, like a curly Q. It's also choose your own adventure, like, you know, where it's like, let's think of the three possible outcomes our user will take, and that covers 80% of the most likely things to happen, and 20% we'll have an error message or something like that, right? But in order to have these conversations, you have to work directly with your developer. It is a co-creation, to your point, Taylor. It's a co-creation process, right? And it's not just design. Engineering has to come over and say, okay, what are we building together? Like, how are we doing it? But designers can make engineering's life much easier by saying, hey, you know, here's what we're thinking. This is what the journey could look like. This is what we need to build for. And they can make your life easier by saying, these are the components that we have, and here's what it's meant to do, right? So then you can say, okay, these are my limitations. This is the scope of it, right? And that helps quite a bit. The last thing on here before I get to the kind of resources that I left in here, a reminder that language is part of the interface, right? It's UI, but it's language. Language is the interface in agents. And we saw that to a great degree on here, right? It's almost too much. It's too much interface here, right? But these are language products. And so we have to think about not just the visual cues and, you know, the affordances that we use in order to guide users, but also the language too. So what should it sound like when the agent is updating you? How much information should it to give you? Should it, again, I'm going to go back to my favorite one. Should it tell you what tools it's using? You know, because it's like, do we care? I don't know. You know, I have a strong opinion on that one. But, you know, how much information should we give users that in order to, what's the balance of information between giving you enough that you can troubleshoot and figure out what's going on, right, as the agent does the work, but also not overwhelm you? And then you get lost trying to troubleshoot. And that's a balance. And to answer those questions, you have to prototype earlier in the process. And this is where it gets challenging because we may not have the tooling, but you have to test these things out early in the process and look at like, okay, I've got a user journey. Let's see what happens. What does the model say as I'm going through this user journey? Right? And you go, oh, this doesn't make any sense what the model is saying. It's overwhelming. Great. Let's fix that prompt because the UX happens in the prompts and the architecture, but we'll stick with prompts. So additional feedback questions. I left some resources in here too. If you want to broaden your technical understanding, Deep Learning AI has some courses on agent systems. So the top frameworks that enterprises are using, you can pick any of these. They gave me great insight into just kind of how they work, how AI agents work. I only have like some background in Python, but I don't code in Python anymore at all. So, but they have notebooks in there that you can run the systems and then take the code and put it into Claude and have it explain it. So they were really helpful for really helping me kind of think through what the engineers are using to build these systems. And I'll say the Crew AI one did a really good job of telling me how to think about agents. They made it more of a managerial type mental model of assigning tasks to hiring people, as much as that's kind of problematic. Opens up some bigger questions, but being able to kind of think of these agents and tasks that they do on your team. So, remaining thoughts on agents. Can we do it? Are we going to build them? Are we going to get lost in them? Are they ever going to work?
I think we're all speechless because you've been doing such an amazing job.
Dorian,
And if you don't
thanks.
say anything, you can't leave. So
Yes, I know. But I leave you all in good hands because y'all are here talking about this stuff and you can keep having these conversations. I know, you know, Taylor and I have had them and Torian, we've talked about it. And Erica, you're always doing research on this stuff. So like, there's so much, I think, genuine curiosity about these. Like, you don't have to be like kind of a, no, you don't have to know everything about them, but you can just show up and have the conversations about like, hey, I saw this thing. What do we think of this? Right? Here's an agent I found. What do we think of this? How does it work? Right? And I think that's kind of where organizations need to be in general with AI. It's just kind of like show things and say, what do we think? So yeah. Y'all been great.
thank you.
We'll see you all. Have a good week. Stay in touch. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.